Coming along. I appreciate all of you being here. Full screen? Yes, good idea. Function F11. Awesome. So I appreciate you all being here late in the afternoon. I always get a bit tired at this time of the afternoon when I'm at a conference, so I understand you may be as well. Thanks for putting in the conference, Arian. Every time I hear someone talking about education and every time I hear someone talking about open source, I would like to be at the conference because both of those things are something that I enjoy. For a bit of context, I'm a lecturer at Monash University. I used to be a software developer as well. I still do open source software development in my spare time. And the stuff I'd like to talk about today is the two units that I teach at my university. So Monash University, it's a big university. There's about 50,000 students or something. Higher, okay, 80,000 students, there you go. In the Faculty of IT this year, we'll have 550 master's students in semester one completing their masters, and we'll have 180 undergraduate students completing their undergraduate degrees. These are the ones who aren't going off and doing placements or doing research. So they're doing courses, and we provide the final course that they do, which is called a capstone unit. A lot of different universities might have different names, but the idea is that you want to bring together all of the skills that you've learned throughout your degree in a final project-based unit, and we try and make it as similar to industry as possible. We want you to be treated like a professional. We don't want you to think of yourself as a student anymore. Right? A lot of students go through university thinking, how do I get a HD? What boxes do I check to get a HD? And we don't want that because when you go into industry, that's not how it works. You need to solve problems. So our undergraduates have a client, a real client who wants a website of some description, and they will have to talk to humans and understand what the business problems are, and then solve those business problems. The postgraduates, they have something a bit more entrepreneurial. We give them a theme, something to do with societal good. So you might take global warming or refugees or homelessness, and then we say, go find some open data and then find a problem in that space and solve it. Build a website, build a mobile app. We don't care what technology you use because we want you to start doing more self-learning. We want you to start exploring options and deciding on what the best tool for a job is. So just for a quick bit of overview, this is what some of the studios look like. We don't want labs of computers, rows of computers sitting there, because that's not what most office places look like. So we put people in teams, and we actively make sure to put people in teams that are multicultural. We put them in teams that are gender diverse. We put them in teams that have different skill sets, so different master's degrees and different bachelor's degrees. And you can tell that we don't have to stage these photos. These are nice, proper multicultural photos because we put a lot of effort to make sure that our teams allow people to learn communication skills with different people. Any of the older people in this photo are people from industry, so various different companies within Melbourne come and mentor our students throughout the process as well to give them feedback. We try and think about soft skills as well, like ideation. In the top left, there's a bunch of people doing some ideation about their solution. We try and get them to think about project management using Kanban and so forth. And then they build some nice looking products, hopefully. Maybe that's a credit-worthy product in the bottom right corner. And then we have an expo at the end where we bring people from industry in to showcase what they do. So that's the context that we're working with. We're working with students who I don't want you to think of as students. I want you to think of as the people that you're probably going to employ when you see someone come out of a university. What skills would you like them to have? What would you like them to be exposed to before they finish their degree? I also like open source. Been in linux.conf for quite some time now. And I've seen some talks at perhaps earlier education mini-conferences where someone will say, I've ripped out all of the Windows computers from this high school and replaced them with Ubuntu machines. I'm like, that's a great talk. As an open source evangelist, I like that sort of talk. Unfortunately, that is not why I came here to talk to you, as you probably can tell from the title of my talk. However, we do use open source. We use tools that are open source tools because they're the best tools for the job. I don't use Git because it's open source. I use Git because it's a really, really good tool for the job. Right? So in some sense, we've already won. Open source is great, and we can move on, and that's fine. But that wouldn't be a very interesting talk. So what I want to talk about is these students that I was talking about, we want them to be professionals. We want them to think about how to solve problems like professionals solve problems. How do you do that when you can't just walk into a company, you can't just open the door to some random private company and say, I want to watch you do a code review. I want to watch you set up continuous integration on your server. And in some sense, I could stand there and tell them why these skills are important, and I can give them assessment items that'll assess them on how well they do these projects, but I don't want our unit to feel like a university unit. Right? I want them to do these things because they appreciate that they're useful in industry. So we can use open source communities to help show these groups of students how real human beings in real IT projects solve problems. And if you ask any of my students at the beginning of the semester, they'll tell you the number one problem they're going to have is a technology problem. They'll also tell you that at the end of the project, the number one problem they have is a technology problem. But we know that that's not true. The number one problem they have is people problems. They can't communicate with each other. They speak different languages. I don't mean spoken languages. I mean business analysts and network security specialist students speak different languages. They don't communicate in the same way. It causes all sorts of problems. They do get much, much better at it towards the end, but they don't think that that's a skill they're learning as they're going along. The second problem they have is business problems. They don't understand how to talk to a business and understand what the business problems are. And then the third problem they have is technology problems. So let's have a look at some of these examples and how you can dive into an open source community that is transparent, everything's published online, and you can start showing people how these problems are solved in real IT teams. Number one problem is people problems. Generally, that falls down to communication. So let's have a quick look at some good communication examples. Not just LCA, most open source projects will have a code of conduct. If you're in a modern agile software development team, you might have a social contract. All right? Social contract where your team sits down and decides what an appropriate way to resolve problems is if you have a disagreement with somebody. And it's really important that that contract is written by the team members themselves. It's not thrust upon them by a manager. Right? And in some sense, a code of conduct is very much like that. It's a bunch of like-minded people in the community deciding that this is how we're going to solve problems. We're going to act like grown adults and solve problems together. So I think this is a really good analogy for what people do in the real world. So if I go tell my students, can you please come up with a social contract for how you're going to address problem resolution, I'm not just telling you that because I thought it was a good idea. I'm telling you that because lots and lots of organizations care about this stuff. Here's another example. Someone told me that perhaps the Django mailing list would be a nice place to go to find good problem resolution. So have a read through that. I quite enjoy how they resolve this particular problem. So I think we can all agree that that's probably a pretty well-written statement, because when one of the issues with a lot of these open source communities is that the communication is asynchronous and it's written. And when you're doing written communication in an asynchronous manner, you lose a lot of cues. There's no body language, there's no change in tone. So you can write something and be very well-meaning, but unfortunately it might get interpreted the wrong way. So the important thing is how you respond to that. So to be able to show a team who's having trouble with communication that this can be solved by other humans is actually really, really nice. My students need to have regular meetings, okay? So who here has done a university degree before or attended university? A few people? Keep your hand up if you've done group work before. Okay, so in group work, how I remember doing group work was you choose your own team and then you split off and you all go sit in the corner and you work on part of your project, and then just before the deadline, everyone brings their work back together. And that doesn't work when you're trying to build a real solution for a client. All right? You need to be in communication with your team. You think about working in an IT team, there's lots and lots of communication. And the cool thing about some open source communities is that they have open public meetings, regular meetings that are scheduled. You know, we get our students to do stand-up meetings every day. So a lot of them think it's a gimmick, but we know that there's value in constantly touching base with the rest of your team and then understanding where the pain points are and what problems people are having. So to be able to log onto an IRC channel and read the log from any given meeting, there's nothing special about this meeting, this is just a particular meeting that happens every week, is kind of nice. Unfortunately, there's a lot of bad communication examples online as well. I won't go into any details about it, but needless to say, if you want to provide counter examples when people are struggling, sometimes you can help people learn by showing counter examples as well. And I will do it later on for documentation. So this presentation was really quite good the other day, talking about some of that. Requirements gathering. So the first problem people have is people problems. The second problem people have is business problems. And the main thing is, how do you talk to a human and understand what their business requirements are? And then also, how do you communicate that to people? How do you communicate that specifically to technical people who are going to try and build a system for you? it takes practice to be able to get good at writing down issues, logging feature requests, writing bug reports. All of that stuff takes practice. Right? And there's a few things that can help you get better at that, which we'll go over. But for instance, this is what one of my students wrote me. I'm struggling with a piece of code and would really appreciate your help. Any alternative solution in which you could help is also welcomed. So it's polite, but I got that in an email, and that was the only context in the email. Now, if someone posted that on Stack Overflow, you can't answer a question. So I would be willing to sit down and help this person, right? But I would much rather them try and think about the problem they have and then write that in an email instead. Let's have a quick read through this. Okay, so it might be a misguided question in some sense. It's not necessarily the right thing to be worrying about, but they've thought really hard about the problem they're trying to solve, what solution they think is appropriate, what they've tried to do to fix it, and the rest of the email is actually quite good as well. So if that was on Stack Overflow, you would probably get upvoted a few times for writing a good question, and then you would get some nice feedback from people. Okay. So when another thing, what do I want to do here? So one thing that can really help is issue templates, for instance. If I can point students to open source projects that use issue templates like this, they can see that when I send you an email that says, I'm more than happy to help you, but please, please, please tell me, what did you do? What did you expect to see? And what did you see instead? I'm much more willing to want to help you with the problem at hand. And to see that other communities find that valuable, it's not just an academic requirement that I'm asking you to do that, and it's not just me being lazy doing that, is also quite valuable to me. So let's go back to this one. So here's some examples from Bootstrap. What I did was I just went and searched for the most downvoted question to see what it would look like. And in some sense, if we ever read through this, this is an interesting one because the question itself is not particularly well worded. But as you read down, you'll find that it really is just because somebody has English as a second language. So it's not that they're writing a poor question necessarily, although I think the actual request probably could be worded better, even language issues aside. But compare that to another issue, which is one of the most highly voted questions on the Twitter Bootstrap page, which is, here is how you reproduce a problem. Here is, and it got 12 upvotes, so people obviously, either they like the way it's written or they're also experiencing the same problem, can't quite tell. And then they put a screenshot of the specific issue, and whoop, there's some letters dropping off down there. It has been fixed. 7 upvotes, thumbs up. And the response is that people can actually provide responses to this question because there's enough context there to answer. So we struggle quite a lot getting students to put enough information in their emails, in Trello cards, in whatever system it is, and to be able, I love bringing up issues on open source issue trackers that are well written, concise, and would allow me to solve the problem really quickly, okay? My rule of thumb is anyone should be able to pick up your issue and work on it without asking any further questions. So if you got this question here at the top that says I'm struggling with a piece of code, I can't help you. We need to sit down in a face-to-face meeting. Whereas the second one there, I very much can help. Okay, another thing that the students struggle a bit with is prototyping. So a lot of university courses, and our course included, does have the option for students to do usability classes or HCI classes, but it's an elective, and maybe 10% of the students do it. It seems to be going up, which is nice. So they see the value of user experience, but it's still quite low. So not as many open source projects do this, but a lot do. And for instance, the F-Droid project I'm involved with, we have a designer who came on board and started designing a new user interface. And we'd already had a couple of meetings by this point in time, so this is jumping into the discussion halfway through. But what we have is we have a bunch of pretty high fidelity prototypes, and we have some discussion around it. We have some low fidelity prototypes in response to some discussion we had. So you can see that it's quite valuable to quickly draw down some pictures to share ideas. And then once we have that information, we can continue the discussion, and then we have some super high final prototypes that are actually intended for somebody to implement, including some descriptions. And then once we've actually implemented it, we can then go and have a working example. So build the system, then show it to people, solicit more feedback, and seeing that feedback loop happen can be really quite valuable. And then my slides not let me go next. So I'll refresh. Next. And that allows students to do user testing. If you have prototypes, it's much easier to do user testing. It's really, really hard to get students to get up, go out, and talk to humans. They don't like it, don't know why. But to be able to show them examples of user testing online is really, really nice. And I don't mean user testing like this. This is not user testing, right? I mean user testing as in going off and talking to a human being if they're going to use your system. If you're building a dog collar that's open hardware, then go test it on some dogs, that's fine. But you need to get up and put your system in front of people. And I apologize, I keep using the same examples. It's just a project that I'm familiar with. But this designer also went out and did some user testing. And we don't need to read all of the text, but we have a write-up of how the user testing was performed. There's a bunch of tasks that people were asked to do. There's some results about what particular tasks people found difficult, which ones they found especially difficult, and so on and so forth. Then we had some people talking about some qualitative feedback. And then there's some really detailed reports. The students can go and read the detailed report that shows photos of the environment where the testing was conducted. It shows all of the printed out paper cards that were put down in front of the testers so that they could know which tasks to work on, in which order, and so forth. And that's really, really important to be able to show these students that it's not particularly scary. This is something that happens. It's happening more and more in industry. The more industry people we speak to, the more common it is that people are doing this user testing stuff. And I want our students to be able to walk away with that confidence that they can do that. So moving on to more technical topics now. Code review. So when I started as a software developer, the company I was at, we didn't do code reviews. And I didn't grow as a developer until we started doing them about 3 years later. Because you can't get better unless you get feedback from people. If you're just in your own little bubble, you're not going to get better at what you do. So we need that from students. And the problem with students is that, and it's not a problem with students, it's more a problem with academia, is that they've been told don't collude with people through their whole course. Yeah? But we want them to. Non-excessive collaboration, that's right. I would be more than happy if I had, so yes, we have teams, and those teams obviously work close together, right? There's no such thing as collusion when it's group work. But I would be more than happy if 2 separate teams were both implementing Stripe payment gateways at the same time, and they colluded together, right? Well, they worked together, so they can learn from each other. Because most of the time, this isn't a programming course. This is an IT capstone unit where everyone is from all around the faculty is working together. So I don't care if you go and find a library that does exactly what you want. You're not trying to show me how much of a rockstar programmer you are. You're trying to show me that you can communicate well, work in a team, work effectively, and understand requirements. So we want them to realize that code review and being able to look at other people's code, comment on it, and learn from it is a really, really good skill to have. And everyone should be doing it. And the tools are actually freakishly good now. I mean, I don't know how GitHub's going, but GitLab just keeps adding features and features and features to their code review stuff. It's really nice. Documentation. So I spent a bit of time in the open documentation mini-conf today. My students are actually submitting some documentation next week for me. Here's a counterexample. If I go and search F3 documentation, I get to something that very, very quickly jumps into stuff I don't care about as a user. And it's really quite poor. What we would hope it would look like is maybe something like this. Right? I was quite impressed when I saw the keynote this morning. It's a very nice focus on documentation. It's a bit washed out on this slide, sorry. Maybe that's some feedback we can submit. But otherwise, it seems like quite a nice community of people working on this documentation. And the thing that I care about here is, yes, I care that it looks nice and it's easy to read, but I actually care a lot more about the process happening behind the scenes. Can you go and see a pull request that says, I want to change the documentation because there's a misunderstanding and we can't understand this part of the documentation. And then there'll be a discussion that follows along. Now, to be fair, I haven't actually done that with my students, and I tried to find some nice examples today, and I didn't succeed, hence here we are. But I think I will go and search for some more because I really like that idea that when you look at some documentation, there was humans that produced that. And it was probably multiple humans, and they're probably working together collaboratively, making decisions about what to include and what not to include. Okay? We tend not to give our students a list that says, well, your documentation must look like this. Instead, we just say, go off and document your system. And then we give you a whole bunch of examples of good documentation, maybe some examples of bad documentation. And I want to see how much initiative they have. You know? But we don't have 2 weeks where we sit down and have a special guest come in and lecture about documentation. Maybe we should. Continuous integration and continuous deployment. Again, this is one of those things, it would be really nice if I did have time to sit down and talk about these skills and say, this is how you're expected to do test-driven development, this is how you're supposed to do automated testing, this is how you're supposed to do automated deployment, and so on and so forth. But it just doesn't quite fit into the course that we have right now, for better or worse, probably for worse. But to be able to go take someone to a project that has a relatively complex pipeline, where here's an Android project that needs to run on multiple different Android devices, it has a whole bunch of unit tests that run and code quality metrics that run on it as well. Yeah. I should. I'll use that as an example next time. Samba, okay, I'll go check that out. But we do want one that we can jump into and kind of maybe understand what's going on, maybe not, depending on how confident you are. Yeah. Working on Android is quite messy. So it's quite nice to be able to show off these sort of skills to students. So I tend to talk a little bit faster when I'm giving presentations, I apologize. But do we do open source stuff at uni? Yes, we definitely do open source stuff. No, I don't evangelize open source because I'm not telling my students what technology to use. They're choosing what technology to use. I'm there as a mentor, and I'm there to help support them in whatever problems they face. But I do find it I find myself increasingly more often going to a project, let's say, normally one that I've worked on because I'm familiar with the discussion that's happened behind the scenes, to be able to show students, this is how you should be behaving, this is how you should be acting, this are the skills that people find valuable in the real world. And that is all I have to say. Thank you very much.
So what about the inverse of actually having, like famously Oregon State University does a lot of deliberately putting students into open source projects or building open source things that will benefit the open source community as the project, so that they learn, because even if a significant part of our industry now is actually this amazing world of open source, and students need to learn or be taught how to actually act, not just seeing our community, but in our community. Because otherwise the projects themselves have to teach them that, and that's hard. We should be better at it, but it would be really good if, and I was wondering if that was something else that was offered as a capstone course, is actually, not do it where the customer is an open source project that they're working with.
Yeah, so I did actually have this idea before I was a lecturer. I was thinking of like a Google Summer of Code style project in some sense, maybe not for the capstone unit, but getting students to be encouraged to contribute to open source projects as part of their curriculum, I guess. And the answer is no, we don't do it. Why we don't do it, no specific reason. If I was to go through the rationale of what we do now, a lot of the students who are graduating aren't necessarily there's quite a diverse range of skills, and yes, open source projects require all of the skills. We need business analysts to be interested in open source, and we need network security specialists to be, just as we need software developers. But realistically, most of the people at the university doing a generalized IT degree are probably going to either go work for small firms building software for small customers, or they're going to go to bigger firms where, think like Telstra or ANZ or big banks, things like that. So yes, you would still learn valuable skills working in an open source project, obviously. I clearly think that. But no, we don't do that. Could we do it? Maybe. But bureaucracy. Cool. Yeah. Thanks. Oh, another question?
And as someone who's fairly key in an open source project, what could we be doing to make it more, some of the things we do, easier for you to actually see as examples and things? Is there things that open source projects are doing, like you were saying, I'll show them things in my project because I can give them the extra background that's not really there. Are there other things that you notice that we're missing, that means that we're a little bit harder to understand?
Yeah, so again, something from the keynote this morning, I was flabbergasted by that documentation site that talked about how the business unit ran.
Yeah.
So how the humans ran, how they made decisions, that sort of stuff. And yes, you probably could go find that. But things like that meeting example I had was quite a poor example. It would be really nice if most projects do have regular meetings. And yes, most projects actually do welcome people to come into those meetings, and they will put somewhere that we have a regular meeting. But in making sure that that's visible, and if you do go to a community, for instance, that doesn't have a code of conduct, adding a code of conduct. After it doesn't have one, we should have one. Yeah, but I think meetings and all of that human, fleshy stuff, anything that you do, any decisions that you make, that if I was fresh out of uni, I wouldn't have, haven't worked in an industry before, haven't worked for a company. I don't know how people decide, let's say who decides who gets commit access.
Yeah.
That's a social problem. And it's a problem that's kind of nice for grown-ups to be able to discuss as adults and come to a conclusion of.
Okay.
Most of the technical stuff's fine. Yeah. Thanks.